All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We're here today because of the recent murder of George Floyd and others. And there's a shift happening in our country, and it seems like many people have had their eyes open to the racism that still exists in this country. However, it's important to realize that many of our African American colleagues aren't surprised at all by these occurrences. Um, so I asked these leaders, African American leaders at the Johnson Space Center and at NASA, to join us today to talk a little bit about these social issues. This will be the first in a series of conversations that I hope to have with leaders at our center. And it's my expectation that if you are a leader at JSC, that you have these conversations within your teams. A couple things I would say about that: it's important to be prepared for these conversations, and what I mean by that is not be an expert in race. You come in, you should bring your authentic self to the conversation. You're an expert in your experiences, but also to be ready to make sure that the conversation is a safe place, and that there is a chance to have an open dialogue, and that does take some intention and preparation. And there are resources available for you from our ODEO office that would enable you to have those conversations. So we're really, really blessed to have these panelists today. I'll introduce them, and then we'll get started. So first, Vanessa Weish Vanessa's had many key leadership positions at NASA, Johnson Space Center, in shuttle, Constellation, commercial crew, and also at center levels. And now she is the deputy center director of the Johnson Space Center. Daryl Gaines has had a long career at NASA, and actually you've served in many different centers at Marshall. Now he's actually the assistant to the center director at Stennis Space Center, and he's had many key positions at the Johnson Space Center and Space Station and others, including working on the 9th floor in the center director's suite as the chief of staff. And that's where Daryl and I work together. Let's see, Victor Glover, naval aviator, astronaut, and he will be flying on Crew 1, on the Dragon on Crew 1, probably in the early fall. So great to have Victor with us. And then Kofi Burney. Kofi started at JSC with the Mission Operations Directorate, then actually went to outside industry for a while, came back to NASA, and now is the deputy of the Information Resources Director at JSC. So again, all great leaders at JSC, and we are really blessed to have you here today. Thank you for being here with us. I did want to say for the audience and for others, for other white people like me, it's important that we don't expect people of color to have to be our educators. If you don't know much about race or racism, then you should spend the time to learn by educating yourself, be a resource for yourself and for others. And doing that releases people of color from being the exclusive resource for you. And so I think that's important to know too. But anyway, I really appreciate all of you coming today. And what I'll do is just start with some questions, and then I know we're going to have a great dialogue today. So I'll start with Vanessa. Given the recent events in our country, how are you doing?
Well, good morning, Mark, and everyone, and thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this panel. So I'm doing well. One of the things that I kind of think about is this lady at my church, and when you ask her how she's doing, she always says, "Fine for how things are." And I've never really thought about it that much until recently. And from a perspective of, there are things that are going on outside of the home, outside of the job, with regards to COVID, with regards to the protests. And so you have to just remember, that you're doing okay, right? Personally, you're doing okay, but others are not. And so just caring about and having empathy for what's going on outside of myself. So I'm doing fine, but I do know that, we have to be concerned about how people are dealing with COVID and how they're dealing with the discussions around racism.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Vanessa. Daryl, how are you doing?
Good morning. Good morning. Mark, I really appreciate you for inviting me to the panel. And, I see, I'm doing well. And I think this, along with future conversations about this, is part of the healing process. And so I think that, I want to applaud you for coming up with the idea to do this talk. And I'm still processing some of it. When I think about, what happened with George Floyd, I often think about all the other folks, all the other deaths that occurred that are similar, and, the impact that those are having as well. And so I think, the thing that we can do to help this is like we're doing today, being a part of the solution. I think I'm very hopeful when I see the folks who can affect change are actually making changes now and having dialogue. So I think this is a great time for change and a much needed change. And I'm happy to see that. So I'm doing well and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Daryl. Kofi, how are you doing?
Hey, Mark, thank you. And I guess I'm glad to be a part of this panel and I guess having this discussion, this conversation. I guess going back to the video, I was very emotional seeing that. It's hard to see 8 minutes and 46 seconds of another human being going through that type of an emotional, painful experience. It caused a lot of emotions within myself. I've probably gone from being upset to being saddened, even tears at some level because of that. And, that makes you look inward and think about kind of what you can do. I'm an engineer by nature, so I always try to solve problems, right? That's kind of what I fall back on. So, I've come a little ways, I'm a little better. I've had friends, coworkers, colleagues reach out and ask how I'm doing. So that, to Daryl's point, to Vanessa's point, kind of gives you some hope that folks are at their, reaching out and showing concern and being caring about that. So I'm hopeful on the trajectory that the country is going in. We've taken some steps, I think. So I am a little hopeful, but it's still very painful to watch. It's one of those memories I don't think you will ever get it out of your head going forward. So, but I have seen some changes, so I'm hopeful at the end of the day.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, that's incredible to watch. And I appreciate you sharing that, right? Being vulnerable with that and talking about how that affected you. Victor, how are you doing?
I like what Vanessa said about the lady at her church. I'm doing good, given all that's going on. For me, it's an interesting time preparing for this mission and being, potentially a few months out from launch. And so when I think about focus, a lot of things trying to steal my focus. And so I try to spend my time getting ready for this mission and then getting my family ready for the mission. And so any spare time or capacity I have is usually dedicated to my family. And lately we've been talking about the things that they're reading and hearing on the radio and in the news. And so, it gives me a tension, which I guess is the overall feeling that I have. And it's not new, but tension is how I feel. I have my family and I watch my nephew. I have my 4 daughters, my nephew that we look after, and my wife. And I go to bed at night knowing that they're safe and I can hear where they all are. And that makes me feel very good. But at the same time, I feel for the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and I can go back. The mothers of Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown were at George Floyd's funeral. And I feel for them and their families. And one of my daughters, in talking about this, she just kept shaking her head and saying, "It's not fair. It's not fair." And so trying to help her process the emotions that she was experiencing. And that's what made me realize that, you know, it's okay to not be okay with these things. No one should be. But we need to talk about it. And so I know that it's been said over and over, and I am going to just say it again. Thank you for doing this. It's timely and it's appropriate, and all of the other efforts that have been going into making sure that JSC is taking care of its workforce. And that's what is really great to know is going on. So thank you for the efforts and for everyone who is involved in making sure that JSC is taking care of our community.
Thanks, Victor. And yeah, and I can imagine that sometimes we feel like I can deal with it. I'm an adult, right? I can work through it. But then having to have that conversation with your kids just must be that much more difficult, right? And your fears for them too must be that much more difficult. So, well, let's see, Vic. How about what are your hopes for this conversation, and do you have any hesitations that arise when you have these conversations at work? Be interested in your thoughts on that.
I'd be happy to respond to that one. So just to have the dialogue, I think to have any hope beyond that, it assumes too much that one, I know where this should go. And as you said at the beginning, I am not the expert. It is not my responsibility to help the world navigate this, but I will help and be a part of the motive force and do my part. So just to have the dialogue, that's one. And I think that if I were to put anything into the conversation, there's personal experience, obviously, and I'm happy to share that. But for me, it's important to not slice into right now and oversimplify it to what's going on right now. If you listen to the music and the movies of popular Black culture, you will see this as a common thread throughout. As long as I can remember my parents' and my grandparents' generation, the same applies. And so I would encourage folks to go and read the things that already exist to understand this better. And we all can do that, no matter what race, gender, age you are. And so there are lots of great resources that you can use to gain some context. Because for me, this time may have really galvanized the planet. But there's a situation where a young woman was killed by a group of police that had a warrant, but they went into the wrong unit of a duplex. And her life was taken in that ensuing conflict. And the reason why that stays with me, her name was Aiyana Jones. And Aiyana was 7. My oldest daughter was 7 at the same time. And so Aiyana would have turned 18 this year if she was still alive. That for me was, I couldn't understand how it didn't make national news and how it didn't galvanize the planet, that this beautiful baby in the place of comfort, sitting on her grandmother's couch, lost her life. And so to understand that piece of this, how you're right, it's nothing new. It's just something that we all must deal with, and we all have a part to play in it. We all have a part to play in this. And I think there are resources to help us do that effectively, and also to help get us on the same page when we dialogue, because some of the terms in this dialogue can be divisive, and it's important to get beyond the terms and maybe really talk about meaning. And I think that helps to move the conversation forward.
Yeah, I would also like to add just a better understanding of experiences, and that our experiences are all different. The way that I experience things, what I've experienced in my lifetime, are different than what Victor and Kofi and Daryl have experienced. And so that people could have a better understanding. One of the things, hope from the conversation is just that, we're wanting folks to know that, just as Victor said, we're not saying we have the solutions, because, we need everybody to be a part of the solution, as we need everybody to be a part of the conversation. So hopefully that you having this panel and having this dialogue will help others to be able to have their own conversations in their own groups, in their own voices.
Hey, Mark. So, kind of just to add on, and Victor and Vanessa, part of my hope is, these are hard conversations to have. These are difficult conversations. it's not easy. It's something that's going to be uncomfortable for folks, and not just for people of color, but for people of color as well. These are uncomfortable conversations. We haven't traditionally had these type of conversations in the workplace. So asking somebody to sit and have a conversation with somebody they know only on a work level and ask them to talk about race and racism and how that can impact things and how do you feel about it is uncomfortable. So my hope, to add on, is just that we can start to have that conversation and everyone can kind of broaden their perspectives there, and continue to build on that. So I think this is a good first step. And again, I feel like Victor said, just to kind of thank you for, having that, being uncomfortable, right? Putting yourself and saying, hey, let's talk about it. Because it's kind of a third rail. We just don't talk about it at work. It's just, it goes unmentioned. And that's not, that's just kind of how things were. It's not like we had a rule book that said don't talk about race, but we just haven't. So I'm hopeful that we can start to have that dialogue and like everyone says, I'm not a spokesman for Black people, but I'm willing to have a dialogue if somebody wants to talk about it, because it is impactful. I mentioned I mentioned to you, Mark, but I have a nephew, and even when he was 8 or 9 years old, we had to have a very frank conversation around how to conduct himself around the police, law enforcement, and just in public in general. And he's actually a pretty tall kid for his age, so he looks a little older than he might be, or than he is. And so just to have that dialogue was very important for me, just to make sure he knew how to conduct himself. So I think, again, I'm hopeful that folks can hear this and understand some of the realities that it comes to being a person of color, and just having to deal with things from a racism standpoint or from a race standpoint. So.
Thank you, Kofi. I think, go ahead, Daryl. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think, everybody, hit the mark with all their comments. The only thing I would add is that, my hope is that this becomes a tool for healing and understanding, because, like Kofi said, this is a complex situation when you have good policemen mixed in with policemen that will cause situations like this that cause for concern, and you're asked to trust those people. It just puts you in a difficult situation. And so I hope that this will be a tool for folks to understand that that situation and what that's like for someone like me or Kofi or Victor or Vanessa. And so that is my hope for what comes out of this today.
Yeah, I think, one of the things about this conversation, which is so powerful, is that I think many of the folks at JSC know at least one of you pretty well. I mean, I know several of you. But when you hear these stories from people that you know well, it's a lot different than watching someone that was on TV on the news. It's more abstract. But when it's someone that you work with, it has a completely different impact. And so the power of your stories, I mean, I don't want to underestimate that. So maybe actually, Daryl, if you don't mind, I thought maybe you and I have had you and I had a dialogue about, it's probably 5 years ago, about an experience that you had. And if you don't mind walking through that, then I can talk a little bit about how it affected me and how your willingness to talk to me really opened my eyes to some things. So if you don't mind, I think that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So this was one morning on my way into work, and coming through Webster, I was passing through the school district, and so I slowed down so that I was driving the speed limit. But then once you get past the school, there's a speed sign that allows you to speed up. And so I started speeding up at that point, and I got pulled over as soon as I got outside of the school zone, and the police officer was just ranting and railing, and just so the conversation was, I mean, it was just so much disrespect in, you know, his voice, his tone, that it just, you know, it kind of frightened me. But something inside of me was saying to stay calm and explain the situation to him. And so once I explained it to him, it actually de-escalated him to where he understood, and didn't give me a ticket. He just told me to slow down, and gave me and let me go. And so, but by the time I got to work, I was so shaken by it. You know, it just, I had to talk with someone about it. And so Mark, you know, was the first person I saw coming in, and decided to have the conversation. And so, you know, just talking with you about it, going through that, and just explaining to you helped me a great deal, to sort of calm down and understand what happened. So I appreciate you for that conversation. And I'm quite sure that, you know, it was something that I carry with me. It's still very vivid in my mind today, of how he was talking to me as if I was, you know, one of his kids. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what was dramatic about that, I think for me, we talked about, this is not new. George Floyd dying is not new. I can't remember who it was 5 years ago, but there had been another killing in that time frame. This is what I remember. And then you came in, and and you were very honest about it, and how you were shaken, right? How you were still like, I am trying to get my heart rate down. This is the way you described it to me. And what was dramatic to me, I've been pulled over, you know, and it's irritating, and it's embarrassing, but I never was afraid. You know, I never felt like I was afraid. And I've never had a conversation with my sons about, I never felt like I had to be extra cautious. You know, certainly you want to be respectful, and you want to sit there and, you know, and no sudden movements. But the way you describe it to me, and then the way you described it, that you have had this conversation with your sons, and Kofi talked about it, Victor talked about it, and Vanessa has talked to me about it before. It just floored me that this was something that you had to do that was totally outside my experience. But again, because I knew you, right? We had, you know, we've eaten lunch together, we've been on travel together, we've been in meetings together. It was that much more real. And so I appreciate you sharing that with me, because it really opened my eyes. And, you know, it was a little embarrassing. I was 55, I'm not 10, right? And to be that clueless can be, you know, a little embarrassing, but, you know, it's the truth. And the sooner I can learn the truth and move forward, the better. And I really appreciated you sharing that with me. I know Kofi mentioned it already. I know, Vanessa, you've maybe as a mother, I think you've had these experiences before. You mind sharing with us and your experiences in the same kind of event?
Yeah, while Daryl was talking, you know, as a mother of an African-American son, and just, you know, having the talk, and I'm sure maybe people, if they don't know what the talk is, it is what African-American parents have with their children, and specifically with their sons. Because, you know, for whatever reason, and it's, you know, it's sad that we have to have that conversation to be able to empower them to be able to survive. And I say survive, Mark. With my son, you know, even when he was, you know, Kofi was talking about his nephew, you know, at a young age, you know, having to talk about how to conduct yourself so that you're not singled out, even with the conversation, they do get singled out. You know, my son was one of maybe 6 African-American kids in his elementary school. And I was thinking about how, my husband and I, we had to be very active. We had to, participate more so probably than any of the other parents, because you want to make sure that your kids get a fair shake. And he had a teacher one time that literally this woman was bullying our son. And we had to go to the school district, to advocate on his behalf. Thankfully, she decided to go to another, and my son thrived. But that, along the way of having to make sure that your kids are protected, but having that talk and knowing that they have to understand how to engage with the police. Our son, we even had him take a class, to be able to understand how, to conduct yourself so that you're not perceived as a threat. Like Daryl said, he had to de-escalate the situation. And unfortunately, my son's 26 years old. He's an Eagle Scout. He's a college graduate. He's a Boy Scout. But just this past week, he had an encounter with the police. He unfortunately set off the alarm at a building that he works in, and but like Daryl said, they come in at you, they're yelling, they're screaming, they are so hyped up. And so, but he has been taught how to survive, how to de-escalate the situation. But it could have gone another way. I mean, guns pulled, and I look at the situation and I'm like, did they really have to pull guns because the alarm was going off? You see one person, but maybe that's how they're trained. I don't know, but the point is that yes, we have to really we have to do that. We have to talk to our kids so that they actually survive. My sister, she didn't want to have the talk with her son, and our sons are the same age. And I remember they were maybe around 12, and her son began to have, situations in the school where they were putting him into detention, and at like every week, and my parents were like, what is going on? This is not normal. But over time, my sister realized she had to have that conversation. She had to help him understand how to navigate what, we call the system, right? And once he learned how to do that, then his life, he's a college graduate. You actually met him. He marched with us in the Thanksgiving Day parade. But he's a good kid. But they have to learn how to interact. And it's interesting because we know that other people don't have to have those conversations. We know that the majority is not having to have conversations around how to navigate.
Yeah, Mark, and I shudder to think what happened to one of my kids in the situation I was in, with the temperament that they have at such a young age, and not knowing not having the communication skills I had. I can just swap myself for each one of them, and the burden of that is very frightful.
Yeah, it must be scary, right? Like you said, it's just to think about if they were in that same situation, then they're just kids.
Right.
And it'd be risky just because they're a young adult. Yeah, I can't imagine. Victor, you had an experience, or actually, you shared with me an experience you had with the police also, but also that your father was a policeman. You mind sharing with us a little bit about that and your experiences there?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back again to highlight this tension or the balancing that's required. Vanessa just touched on a lot of it. after you have the talk, having to navigate the system. I lived with a police officer. He was retired at this time of this incident, but growing up, my father was a police officer in the community that we lived in. And so I had an example of a great police officer that was someone that I loved. And so after I'd gone to college, I graduated high school, I go away to college, and I'm home visiting. And my best friend and I, as preppy as we can be, I've got on a Cal Poly polo shirt where I went. He went to San Diego State. He's got on a red polo shirt. I've got on a green polo shirt, and we're in khakis and Doc Martens. And we walk out of a Kmart that was 2 blocks from my house. And so we walk out of the Kmart, and there is a line of squad cars in front. And the officers are behind the door. And I know what this looks like. This looks like a situation where weapons could be drawn. They weren't out in front talking to us. They were behind the car, and they told us to get on the ground. And one of the officers comes forward and asks us for ID. And we both hand them our college ID cards. And he yells at us and wants our driver's license. And then he's yelling at us again and asking if I live at the address on my ID. And I tell him the address. And he said, the question was, do you live at the address on your ID? And I was like, yes. And so fast forward, a long story short, we're laying on the ground, flat on the ground, face down, in front of this Kmart in my neighborhood. I can't tell you, I couldn't really even untangle the knot of feelings I had. I'm 19. So Daryl, your comment earlier resonates with me. I am your sons. And I was feeling upset, hurt, embarrassed, all kinds of things. And it just so happens my stepmother drives to that Kmart, and she pulls into the parking lot, and she walks up and she sees what's going on, and she goes around it. As she's going in the entrance, she sees me. She turns around and hightails it back to her car, goes home, and a few minutes later, she shows up with my father. And my father approaches the officers, shows them his retired badge, and you could just see the tension melt out of the situation. He has a conversation with them quietly. They give us back our ID. We get up, we go. We take my friend home, and on the drive to our house, my father tells me that we're going to go to the station and file a complaint. But I want you to know that an officer was struck and killed by a driver, and that may be one of the reasons that they were all in that situation. That can be very tough for officers. And again, the feelings that I was walking around with, after hearing my dad say that, understanding, actually knowing at 19, feeling for those officers and understanding what they may be going through, made me even more frustrated, because I wondered if any of them understood what I was going through. And so it just, it's given me a perspective that has helped me personally get through life. I have the utmost respect for law enforcement. I'm a military officer. I think my decision to join the military and serve was from watching my father serve at his community. And so I have the utmost respect for those who put others before themselves. You know, I believe in God, and whether you believe in God or not, we all follow the golden rule and believe that there is value to human life. And to see people that put the lives of others before their own is something to be respected and honored. So it gave me, again, that tension in having to understand both sides, and I think to have open and honest, frank conversations. But I also think it's important to be informed. And so, having my father, I've been talking to my father about these situations as these things have unfolded. And I always appreciate his perspective, because it's a little different than most people that I know. And so I'm grateful that I have him. But I wonder how that situation would have turned out if I did not have a father who was a police officer, and him being able to show up in that situation, how it could have gone down. And so at the time I had those emotions, and, over 20 years later, now I walk around thinking about, wow, now I really understand a little bit more and how that could have gone. And again, I'm just grateful, but I am concerned about a lot of young folks, my nephew, my almost 10-year-old nephew, that's going to have to navigate these things, whatever they're going to be like in the next decade. And hopefully us having these conversations and the country and the world being where it is, there is something different about the now, and maybe we make a future that he doesn't have to carry around that tension in.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you, Vic. And it's very, I can't imagine because having a dad that is a police officer and then being treated like this by other police officers, and like you said, just if he hadn't been there, right, how it might have gone, even though you were doing everything that they asked. Anyway, that's a incredible story. For me, I think this last few weeks has really convicted me about my responsibility for the police in my area, because I feel like I've asked these people to do a very hard job, a very dangerous job. They're doing that for me. I vote for the officials that set the standards. I pay the taxes that enable it. And I feel like that the behavior that is exhibited by the police force, which often is awesome, and then we're seeing a characteristic that is really bad. I feel like that reflects on me as a person that is part of the society that asks these folks to do that job. So we feel like these cases are not really anomalies. If you see them enough, it's a characteristic. When I think of flight hardware and NASA, and you see something enough, it's not unusual. It's actually a characteristic, and I feel responsible that characteristic does not represent me, and I have a responsibility. To set my expectations and to help the police, right? They do a hard job. We've got to make sure that they have the training and the money and the expectations and enforcing those expectations. So I really feel much more convicted about that these days, and taking responsibility for that.
And Mark, can I you saying made me realize at the very beginning of this, you asked us all how we were doing, and I think you just touched on how you were feeling. And so I wanted to say, one, I appreciate knowing how you feel, and I appreciate hearing your perspective, because I think when it comes to these conversations, it's really easy for people to say, I don't have that, I don't understand it, and that can be one of the barriers to engaging in this. But something I've been trying to share is we're all involved. We are all involved. And so I appreciate hearing how you feel and you sharing your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to add to that, Mark, when you and I had the conversation about the situation I was in, I could tell that, I could see the authenticity and in your concern, and and that was very helpful for me to see that, you were listening, you understood as much as you could, but you were asking me questions to further understand. And that's just a part of what really helped me. And so I just, appreciate you for doing that and for doing this today.
Kofi, I think you were gonna make a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably just pile on at this point, but I was just going to say something similar as far as maybe I'll expand it a little bit. Just having folks that reach out to you and ask you how you're doing, ask you your thoughts on these things is, to me, very powerful, and it helped me a lot. And I know, Mark, we've had a conversation about it, and other colleagues at work have reached out and asked. I kind of said that in my statement, but it does help. It helps that folks care at some level, and even though there's not a solution, immediate solution here, there is the fact that, I know that there are people out there that care about this, that want to help and want to be a part of the solution going forward. And it just gives you hope. I think we've all kind of mentioned hope in different ways here, but, it just gives you hope that, being proud of this country, I'm born in Detroit, you love this country at a fundamental level, at a basic level, you want the best for this, so, understanding that people are reaching out and caring about you does give you a sense of hope. So just, I guess, piling on to some of the other comments that folks are making.
Great, I appreciate that. Hey, actually, Kofi, let me pull on some things. You've shared some things with me about your career and some experiences you had as a young African-American professional, ways you were treated by society. I wonder if you would share those with us. Yeah.
Yeah, and this isn't so much interactions with the police related, but my name, my parents gave all of my brothers and I African names. So my name Kofi is from Ghana. It means born on Friday. Names actually reflect the days of the week that folks were born on. So Kofi means born on Friday. Before I started my NASA experience, I was looking for a new job, and as you mentioned, I was in the private sector at the time, and I had been applying to a bunch of different companies and trying to find the next step in my career. And so a couple friends suggested I get a headhunter to start looking around. So I met with the headhunter. We talked a lot about what I wanted, and then they made a suggestion actually about how did I feel about going by my initials. Like actually, instead of having Kofi Bernie on my resume, did I think about having KS Bernie, my middle initials, that's KS Bernie on my resume? And at first I was like, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with anything? And they mentioned that, they've seen some bias when it comes to folks' name, when I guess when they do the sorting or they look at the resumes. And they were suggesting that, maybe to get in the door, it might help to just go by initials. And so I asked, so what happens when I show up as a Black man and when I walk into the door? And that didn't make any sense to me. So I ended up, but it did upset me a little bit that either one, that headhunter felt that way, or two, they actually had real experience and had talked to some people who had that kind of thought process, that kind of bias. So, again, it kind of more points to the racism that exists. Again, it's not the majority of folks out there, but it is out there. And, it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. You always, you think about it, but just something that minor, right? Essentially just changing, essentially what I was being asked to do was changing my name. The name that my parents gave me that I was very proud of. And it almost felt like it was asking me to change who I was. And that, that was a little, it did impact me a little bit. But I didn't do it. It was just, it just was, I think, a path too far for me to go down, but it left a mark.
Yeah, it's just like it's hard enough to get a new job, and then to have right on top, which has nothing. And but then the way you talk about it, they were asking you to change who you were, right? Yeah, I can feel that. I can feel that. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Yep. Maybe let's see, Vanessa, I've heard your story about growing up in South Carolina. Do you mind sharing with us a little bit about that and what that was like and your early life in South Carolina?
Well, I have to say I grew up, I'm the youngest of five, and in my family, actually the first to go through integrated schools all the way beginning. One of my sisters actually graduated from a all-Black high school, and then the rest matriculated in between. But I really didn't have a good understanding of the complexities of the world, really, because both of my parents, my dad was a principal, my mom's a teacher, so they could somewhat shelter us and keep us in a cocoon. But there were difficulties. The other people on the panel may not remember when Roots came out as a television series, and when if anybody doesn't know, Alex Haley tells the story of slavery in the United States. and the mistreatment that was visual. You know, it was in the books that you read. You know, about, you know, slavery happened and then Americans were no longer enslaved. But here it was on the screen, and you saw every night you would come home and you'd see your next installation of the story. And there was a lot of tension, a lot of you know, not quite riots, but there constantly there were fights that happened, and that was my first time of understanding that there was this tension that was going on. And that was in the 70s, late or early 80s. But it really wasn't until I went to college that I was the first time that I'd ever been called the N word, or been, you know, clearly signaled out differently. And so that was where the first time I realized that this country, the racism was really, you know, ingrained. And Victor is talking about his father. You know, I fortunate, you know, to have a father who had been in the military, had, you know, college educated, and been dealing with the plight of Jim Crow, et cetera. And I remember my dad sitting down, was maybe one Thanksgiving meal, and we were all around the table. And my father explaining to us that, you know, things will eventually get better, you know, and saying to us that, you know, he, you know, was born in 1920, finished college in the 40s, that when he in the 60s, the civil rights movement, the changes, the right to vote, you know, that Americans, all Americans then had the right to vote. But then looking forward, at this point, this is the 80s, right? And explaining that over time, once integration has happened and we're all living and understanding from one another, that, you know, things would get better. And so I'm looking at where we are in 2020, and I do see hope. I do see the vision that Martin Luther King had. I see the hope that my father had for his children and his grandchildren, that now we are now having the conversation, and we are finally, you know, having our corporate America, the political America, mainstream. When I see these protests, Mark, and I look at the diversity in these protests, then that tells me that we are now at a place where we're going to be able to make a change, and to walk away from the past and put this behind us.
Yeah, you know, and just to add on to that, Mark, to amplify Vanessa's comments, I think you know, you've seen the corporate embrace of Black Lives Matter, and I think that's been, I think to Vanessa's point, it's been very hopeful. I've been seeing letters and notes and messages, communications from a lot of corporations and companies, and that, you know, and you've seen the street signs in different cities across the country. So it does give you a sense of hope that things hopefully can start to have that conversation. I think the NFL, some of the pro sports leagues, I think have gotten in front of that. So it is, you know, as sitting in my little seat in the world, it does feel like there's a sea change happening in a bigger sense. So that is hopeful.
Yes, thanks for that. Yeah, and I imagine still that it's still frustrating. You know, Brown versus the Board of Education was in the mid-50s. I wasn't even born, right? And I'm an old dude. So, you know, I mean, I can imagine how frustrating that is to still be dealing with this. But yeah, perhaps we're seeing a sea change. That's my hope. I think we still have 10 minutes. So I had a couple of questions. that I wanted to go around and ask. Let me start with this one. What is one action that you hope every employee would take after they've watched this panel or been involved in other events? So, any thoughts? What's one action you would hope every employee would take? So I'll start with Vanessa, and we'll go around.
Just one action, and Kofi kind of mentioned this, it's just reaching out, reaching out to one another, and just checking on each other. And, it means so much. I shared at senior staff the other day, when the shooting happened in Charleston 5 years ago, nobody talked about it. And, I think most of the people knew that I was from South Carolina, but nobody said anything. How you doing? And I just dealt with the pain, because that was very, very painful for me, and it still is. When we talk about just the disregard for humanity, that this young man would go into a church and kill 9 people after he prayed with them. It still just blows my mind. But since I mentioned that the other day, I've had people send me emails, just asking, how are you? And sharing their own stories. And whether it be that, hey, I didn't know, I wasn't, but now I am more aware. But anyway, that's my point. Just to check on one another, just to let this, just to have the conversations, just start talking with each other.
Good, thank you. Daryl, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would echo, Vanessa's thoughts on that, and to say that I too have received, emails from, past managers, past friends who have all, just checking on me. How you doing? I understand what's going on. Is that, do you need to talk? And so just that alone is very positive, and gives me hope that, people are paying attention. And I would say, for someone who's never been in that type of situation, to just try to understand, just give some understanding, and like like we're all saying here, just reach out to those folks who are close to you, just check on them, make sure they're okay. So I think that will go a long way for everyone.
Great. Kofi?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I would probably also add, if you see, racism happening, speak up, talk about it. I mean, obviously not confrontationally. Nobody's asking somebody to get in somebody's face but talk about it, discuss it, bring it up. It won't be probably a person of color in that conversation, so maybe there'll be somebody else there. So hopefully my action here is that, folks, if for everybody to be a part of the solution, we need folks that are, kind of on the inside, having that discussion and saying, no, this behavior isn't okay. This isn't what we want to see. We want folks to be, equality. We want acceptance. So, just a call for folks to, if you see a behavior that is, racism or racist, then it's just to call it out, speak to it, discuss it, have that difficult conversation. And sometimes that difficult conversation could be with a family member or with a colleague. There's a way to have that conversation. We recently in IRD had a training on crucial conversations and how to have them. So there's a way to do it, but just to call it out, speak to it. And you probably won't solve it, but at least folks will see you engaged and trying to be a part of the solution.
Great. Vic?
So I'm going to break the rule a little bit, because I can't just say one. When I was in college, we had some activism following the passage of some laws that affected the numbers of people of color that enrolled in the University of California, in the California State University system. And one of our allies was the provost, the sort of the number 2 at our university. And he really helped us navigate the complexities of trying to increase the numbers of students of color that were typically underrepresented. And something he said that has stuck with me since my 20s, my early 20s, was that this is an issue of head, hands, and heart. And so I'm going to give one of each of those because everyone has been mentioning something that I do feel is very important. And that I would say is the hands piece and showing compassion. And even though in COVID-19, we have to physically distance, we need to socially connect and checking on each other. I've had colleagues and friends from all over the world calling and reaching out, and that's been great. And I've been trying to do the same. And I think that that compassion is a very important piece, and I would call that the hands. There's also other things that you can do, and we could get into that later, but that compassion piece is important. In terms of the head, I would say, like I mentioned earlier, reading and getting informed and understanding the legacy. There is a long tail to this TAIL as well as TALE. There's a long tail that you can get caught up on and be informed. So that's filling the head. And then heart, even though the compassion piece and all that are issues of heart as well, for heart, I would say to be introspective. We all carry around with us our own personal, moral, ethical standards. And sometimes we don't really look in that box. We just go around acting and behaving based on what's in that box. But to actually unpack it and to look in there and see, you know, I got this from my parents. I got this from my pastor. I got this from my education. This one, I just have sort of received it by osmosis. And to understand how you feel, because in the end, it really is an issue of heart. And if you haven't been self-reflective, it's going to be hard to make those changes or to be understanding or to be compassionate or to go out and take action, because they're all rooted in our heart. So to use your hands and check on people, be compassionate, fill your head, get informed, understand the history and the data that are out there, and to look in your heart and understand where you are.
Thank you. That's great. 3 really good, important things. Thank you all for that. So we have about a few more minutes. So I'm going to ask, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to mention? So we've talked about a lot of stuff. Anything that's on your heart that you want to make sure we talk about that wasn't mentioned? And while you're thinking about that, I'll just mention a story, a little experience of my own. You talked about reaching out, and I kind of been interrogating my own response to Mr. Floyd's murder and the timeline for that, because there was a lot going on. And in some cases, I didn't talk to friends of mine or people that I know for 10 days after the event. And so I've wondered why was that, right? Because it only takes a 5-minute phone call to say, hey, how's it going? So it was disconcerting to me. I don't know. I remember seeing I don't watch the news, so I remember seeing on the USA Today app, and I'm looking, okay, holy cow, right? This guy's been killed. But we had a launch. I had some personal stuff going on. I think the first time I actually spoke about it was at a town hall, which was 5-6 days after the event. And I remember at that time talking about, how I was floored. I just couldn't believe it, because it took me like 4 or 5 days till I realized the guy had been tortured to death. So that was delayed. And then I didn't call some of my friends until a week later. And so I think what that tells me is, sometimes my own, I didn't see my sons in that event, let's say, that this gentleman getting killed. And so if I don't make that connection, then it doesn't ratchet up in importance on all the things that are going on in my life. It was clearly horrible. But anyway, I've been just interrogating my own thought process, and I realized that my privilege and my what impacts me affects how I react, and sometimes those thought processes are flawed. And so I think that's what's really brought home for me is I need to be, I feel bad that I didn't call people because these are friends of mine, and I need to interrogate that why it took so long. So anyway, I'll throw that out. But now, if you had a chance to think about that, I'll go around. I'll just open this one up for whoever had a question or thought something that was on their heart that they would like to mention.
Yeah, Mark, I'd just like to say, one of the things that I really, I applaud NASA for, and that's the environment of teams and teamwork. And so I would behoove everyone to reach out to your teammates, speak to any concerns you see that they may have, see them, having issue with this or, changes in, how they're responding and acting at work. And so just, be patient, understanding, and support your teammates as we've always done.
Thank you, Daryl.
Yeah, I was, so, we've put a lot of focus and energy on this COVID coronavirus as a society. And it's because it was such a pressing concern. I mean, not necessarily a health concern, but just it was an impact to our way of life and people's health. And so I highlight that because it's going to be important as we start to address some of these systemic issues, systemic racism that we have. Again, it's not everyone, but there's still some systemic things that we need to address. It's going to take some energy and effort. It's not just going to be, and the conversation is important and we need to have that, but it's got to be followed by action. And I liked how Victor said the three things. Part of what I was pulling on with the heart is passionate, and we need to follow that passion with action to actually address some of these things. If we don't, then at some point it just becomes, we're saying the right things. The conversation, again, is very important, but we got to follow that with tangible action to be able to fix this. And we've made some progress. The first steps are always the hardest, right? You got to take those first steps on any endeavor. But I'm hopeful that we follow a lot of the conversations that we have with action, similar to how we've addressed, the COVID coronavirus scenario, where we put a lot of energy and effort into addressing that. And we're still in the middle of that. That's not, we're not at the end of that, but we just got to have the action there going forward.
Great point.
So I'll go. One thing I wanted to touch on was also the younger employees that we have. I listened at the discussion we had with the Weight of the World a couple of weeks ago. And it was clear that some of them were afraid. They were afraid of being seen as outside of the norm at NASA if they were to speak up, if they were to be involved in the protests, if they were to use their voices. And so I just want to let them know that the agency, all the way starting with Bridenstine and with you, Mark, that you support them. And I want them to know that, they're at a place where they, can speak up, that we do want them to be themselves, and that they not have fear of retribution if they are supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just think it's important that be very, very strongly stated, because they are our future, and we want them to know that we support them.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for calling out specifically, right? We count on our folks to be their whole selves at work, and they need to be there without being afraid. And that's a great point to call on that specific point. Thank you, Vanessa. Let's see. Anyone else?
I keep coming back to this idea of being informed. And I don't want to overstate that because there are lots of facets to this complex topic. But I also think this is a time, Kofi mentioned not following it up with action would be a failure, a dereliction on our part. And so I think it's important in order to try to understand what we should do. It's important to understand some of the history, but I think it's also a good time to simply read the things that already do exist. For example, this is a great time to open up a copy of the Constitution of the United States and read what it says, because often the folks that are out there protesting all around the world, it really hit me. I was listening to a story on the way home about a protest in Germany, and they were chanting, "What's his name? George Floyd," in Germany. And I just had to sit in my driveway and experience that. And so you read the Constitution and you can see that some of the things that people are out there moving for, physically, literally moving, taking steps forward over, is to simply live up to the things that we already espouse to value. And that is something we all can walk away with and be on the same page with. The page was written and signed a long time ago. So I think it's an important time to really understand our history so that we can shape the future.
Excellent point. Yeah, and it is our intent. Sarah, a great point too about the actions. I agree. There's some momentum here, and we need to move and we need to take action. So I appreciate that, and Kofi especially about we're taking a lot of actions relative to COVID, and this is no less important. And so that's a great example. And thank Vic. The Constitution is awesome, and it'd be nice if we lived up to its ideals as often as we could. All right. Hey, I want to thank you all again for taking the time to do this today. I know it has helped me a great deal, and I have worked with all of you, and my hope is that, again, the others of the workforce will have learned a lot from your particular experiences and your sharing of those. And as I said before, it is my expectation that leaders within JSC are going to have these conversations at their levels, and we are here to support them in doing that. So thank you again. Thanks for everything you do at NASA, all the great work you do, but especially for your contributions to this conversation today.
And thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mark.
Yes, thank you.
See you soon.
Okay, bye.
Be well.